As always, before I get into the lecture content, I'd like to pause with an acknowledgement of country. I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands across Australia, their elders, ancestors, cultures, and heritage. Okay, so in terms of what I'm going to discuss in this lecture bite, I'll firstly begin by talking about the scientist-practitioner model, which relates to evidence-based practice, which you were introduced to previously. Then we'll start getting into research ethics. So we'll look at the NH and MRC overarching principles that guide research ethics, and then start looking at some of the specific considerations that need to be made when we're conducting research that involves human participants. So let's get into it. So far in this subject, we've explored ethics in a general sense, and we have begun to explore the APS Code of Ethics for guiding ethical practice in psychology. And you've also been briefly introduced to the idea of evidence-based practice, which is where practitioners use the best available research evidence alongside their clinical expertise and client characteristics to guide what course of action they're going to take. So evidence-based practice is consistent with the scientist-practitioner model that the discipline of psychology operates under. So the scientist-practitioner model is the paradigm where psychology graduates are knowledgeable in both research and practice so that they can use their broad understanding of research and apply that understanding to practice, and vice versa. Also, so they can take whatever observation and experiences they might be having in their own practice, in their own real world experience working in the field of psychology, to inform research. But really, this kind of all starts with research. Research is kind of at the core of this model. Research helps to generate empirically derived evidence and knowledge that helps us to understand human behavior. It also helps us to understand how we can best treat and intervene on human behavior when necessary. So for practice to be informed by research, we need research to first help us understand human behavior and what works when we're trying to actually intervene on it. So before we go any further and start looking at research ethics, let's pause and have a look at some of the most famous studies in psychology, and in particular the knowledge that we've learnt about human behavior from these studies. So these studies are quite famous. Some of you might have heard of at least one, if not all of these, but if you haven't heard of any of them, then I hope you enjoy learning about them. So we're going to start at the top left-hand corner. In the top left-hand corner, we have an image of Stanley Milgram's obedience study. So Milgram was interested in understanding why people obey authority figures in particular. So just how far would people be willing to go in order to obey what an authority figure is telling them to do? So he set up an experiment where he told participants that he was interested in understanding learning, that he was testing this theory that people would learn better if they received some sort of punishment for making mistakes. So participants came to his lab where they then met someone who they thought was another participant, but it wasn't. It was kind of a stooge, someone who was involved in the experiment, and they were just pretending to be a participant. The real participant, they played the role of a teacher where they had to read 3 words out to the learner, and the learner was played by the stooge, and the stooge had to repeat the 3 words back to them in the same order. So if the learner got them wrong, which obviously they did deliberately because it was all part of an experiment, the teacher had to administer an electric shock. And these electric shocks, they started at something quite small. I believe it was maybe 10 or 15 volts, quite small. But for each time that the learner got the answer wrong, the teacher had to increase the electric shock by increments of, again, 10 to 15 volts. And these volts went right up to 450 volt shocks. So the teacher and the learner, they were in separate rooms. They couldn't see each other, but they could hear each other. They were talking via little walkie-talkies or microphone things. So the teacher would say 3 words, rabbit, hat, car, and the learner then had to repeat them back in the same order. And when they got it wrong, they had to start with the low intensity electric shocks and increase in intensity for each mistake. Now, every time that the answers would be wrong and the voltage shocks started to increase, the learner would start to make noises to indicate that they are in pain. So you could hear them going, ow, ooh, ow, ow, ow. You could hear them screaming, and some of them would even say, "Oh, my heart, it's hurting! Oh, my heart! Oh, stop, stop, stop!" All things to just generally make the participant feel that they or believe that they were actually hurting someone. So this was all completely fake. The learner was faking it. The shocks weren't actually real, but the real participant didn't know this. So when the real participant was hearing these people make sounds to indicate that they were in pain, they would look to Milgram for guidance on what they should do. They would say things like, "Oh, maybe we should stop." And Milgram would simply say, "The experiment requires that you continue." What he wanted to know was how many people would actually continue right up until the 450 volt shock, even when they could hear other people being hurt. So his guess was around 10%. He guessed going into the experiment that roughly 10% of people would obey right up into 450 volt shocks. But what actually happened was it was 65%. So 65% of people that took part in Milgram's study gave the full 450 volt shock when they were told that they had to by the authority figure. And even though they could hear the person that they believed they were administering it to in a huge amount of pain, which again was all fake. No one was actually physically hurt. Now, in terms of what this study actually taught us about human behavior, or the thing that we learned from this study at the time, it was that regular people can do bad things under certain conditions when they are obeying responses, when they're obeying an authority figure. So yes, everyday people can do bad things in particular conditions when they are told to do so by an authority figure. So authority figures do have a big influence on how we behave. So if we move down to the image underneath that, the next famous study we have is Philip Zimbardo's prison experiment. Now, this experiment was all about understanding the effects of power or perceived power. So Zimbardo wanted to know if there are particular types of personalities that are attracted to positions of power, or if there was perhaps something about the environment or the power structure in and of itself that might influence how people behave. So his way of testing this, he took 24 college students who were all equal status. I think they were all in the same class, or they were all friends, or at least known to each other, but all 100% equal in terms of their status. Zimbardo set up a mock prison in the basement of his lab, so complete with bars that you can see on the picture and all. And he randomly assigned 12 of these students to be prisoners and 12 of these students to be guards. And their task was to basically act out a prison for, I think they were going to do it for about a week. So the prisoners did actually go into this little fake prison, and people did take on the role of the guards. Now, what he found, things went pear-shaped pretty quickly because the guards, they began to quite quickly, psychologically and sometimes even physically, torture the people who were playing the role of the prisoners, to the extent that the experiment was shut down within a couple of days. Although it was intended it would go for a couple of weeks. It got so out of hand that they had to shut it down within days of it actually starting. So at the time, what this study taught us was that power can, and sometimes is, albeit unintentionally, yet easily abused based on understandings and beliefs about what it means to have power when it's done in particular roles. Because remember, these people were all exactly equal in terms of their status and power before they went into the experiment. All that changed was it was told, you're a prisoner, you're a guard, and that's roles that have a different level of power within them. So if we move over, if we stay down on the bottom and move over to the right, we've got a picture that just has a bunch of lines. And this is Solomon Asch's conformity experiment. So Asch was interested particularly in social pressures. So he wanted to understand if social pressure from the majority group influences our behavior in such a way that we might conform. So he did an experiment that was kind of similar to Milgram in that he told participants one thing about what the study was about. Asch told them that it was about visual perception, and he got people to come to just a standard kind of classroom with a whiteboard and chairs, and he drew one line on the board, which was called the exhibit line, and then 3 lines next to it. What he did was then ask participants to say which of the 3 lines on the right here, most clearly or closely matched the size of the exhibit line here. Now again, similar to Milgram, only one of the participants that were in the group was actually a real participant. The rest are all people that were pretending to be participants, but they were actually in on the experiment and they were told to give overtly wrong answers. So when they went around the room and said, which one of these lines here is closest in size to this line here, the stooge participants would say B, C, 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 B, C. And he was interested to know if the real participant would say the same thing, even though it is quite obviously wrong that B and C are not the same length as the line in the exhibit. Again, I think he estimated around 10% would publicly give an overtly, very obviously wrong answer to a question, but what he found was up to 75% of people did. So again, what this taught us is that social pressure or social forces can see people conform. It can see us publicly agree to things that we might privately disagree with, or go along with things that we know are wrong simply to fit in. Finally, if we make our way back up to the top, we have an image of little Albert. So the Little Albert study was done by John Watson, who is considered one of the founders or the fathers of the behaviorist approach to psychology. For those that aren't familiar, the behaviorist approach to psychology essentially argues that all our behavior is learnt and it's all essentially a conditioned response, broadly speaking. So to test part of Watson's theory of behaviorism, the theory that all behavior can be learnt, Watson conditioned a fear response into a young baby known as Little Albert. So he exposed Little Albert to either a rat or a bunny. There's debate around which one it is. I've heard it reported as both. In the picture I've got here, it looks more like it's a little bunny, but in any case, let's just say it was a small furry animal that the baby had no prior reaction to or no response to, because at that stage it was just a small furry animal. So each time that the baby saw the animal, Watson would hit a steel bar with a large hammer, which would obviously make a really loud noise, and it would scare the child. The child would start screaming and crying, as one naturally would when they hear a loud noise. So over time, even when Watson stopped actually hitting the steel bar with the hammer, simply seeing that small furry animal in and of itself was enough to elicit the fear response. The baby would start crying in response to the rat or bunny, whichever one it was. So what this study taught us at the time was that some fear responses can actually be learnt behaviours. So yeah, these are just four of probably the most famous studies. There are some other ones as well that I could have spoken about, but the knowledge that we did learn from these studies, particularly when they were done at the time, was certainly valuable. That knowledge has grown and changed and evolved over time, but at the time these studies were done, these insights were quite important. But we do have to ask if it was all worth it. So was scaring babies and making people publicly feel like idiots, or exposing people to psychological and physical torture, deliberately inducing psychological distress by believing that you're hurting someone. Was this worth the gains in knowledge? Do the ends justify the means? And the short answer in modern day psychology is that absolutely no, they do not. These studies would absolutely never be conducted today in the form that they were back then. And this is because we now have regulatory bodies that oversee ethics in research. So these days, all research that involves human participants is overseen by and must be approved by an ethics committee. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But those ethics committees, when they're determining whether a study can be approved, they are using the guiding principles that the National Health and Medical Research Council, which is the NHMRC, put forward about how to conduct ethical research. So just like the APS is the peak body for setting out the code of ethics in psychological practice, consider the NHMRC the statutory body that oversees and kind of sets out the guidelines for ethical practice within human research. So again, similar to the APS, there are 4 overarching core principles that should and do guide research with humans. So those are research merit and integrity. And this principle basically means that the research that we do has to have some kind of expected benefit, and it must be conducted by people who are competent to conduct that research. So this just means that, we don't conduct research simply because we think something is interesting, or that it just might be cool to know whatever it is that the research might tell us. We have to do research where there will be some benefit or some greater good that will come from the research rather than just being interesting. The merit side of things, that's also referring to the people who conduct the research. So people who do the research must know what they're doing. So for example, anyone that has a PhD in psychology is generally qualified to conduct psychological research broadly in their area of expertise. They're probably not qualified to conduct biomedical research because that's a different area of specialization. The next principle is justice. Again, this code, it's about human research ethics. It's not always necessarily specific to psychology. So this particular code here it can be a little bit tricky when it comes to psychology research because it's not always something that is fully relevant to every piece of research in psychology. The other three principles definitely do, but this one, how it looks, can be a little bit different. So the justice principle is getting at the notion that the benefits of research need to be distributed as fairly as possible. Now, to give you an example of when this would definitely apply within psychology, if a researcher was testing or doing a study where they wanted to look at the effect of a psychological intervention that they had created to help improve depressive symptoms, and the way that they did it was almost a randomized controlled trial study where they take one group of depressed patients and give them the intervention that they want to test, and then take another group of depressed patients and make them a control group where they don't get that intervention, and they study them both for, say, 6 weeks and then measure their depressive symptoms at the end. If those results showed that there were positive benefits from the intervention, that essentially the intervention worked, there would be an ethical responsibility to offer that intervention to the control group of the depressed patients, so those who didn't get the treatment as part of the research. Now, again, not all studies in psychology are intervention studies, so it doesn't always necessarily apply that directly. But when it comes to getting approval to do research studies, any committee will still want you to demonstrate how you're adhering to this justice principle. And the way that researchers tend to do that is to offer all participants the opportunity to learn about the outcomes of the research. So they will tell participants that if they take part in this study, they can contact the researchers to find out what the aggregate results of the study are. So there's still ways that we can distribute the knowledge of the research as evenly as possible, even if that knowledge is just, it's not necessarily an intervention per se. The next principle is beneficence, and I guess the gist of this principle is that the benefits of conducting a research study must outweigh the risk. There are always risks in doing any sort of research. They vary in whether they're low or high. Again, that's something we'll talk about shortly. The key thing with this principle is making sure that whatever risks there are, they're both minimized, and the benefits of actually exposing people to those risks far outweigh those risks in and of themselves. Particularly when it comes to psychology research, there might be quite a number of situations in research where we might have to make people feel a little bit uncomfortable. We might have to ask them questions about things that they might not disclose in a hurry. We might have to be slightly deceptive about the true purposes of our research or the aims of our research. For these types of things to be considered ethical, a committee will want to know that the benefits of that knowledge must outweigh the risks. So, for example, one of my main research areas is aggression. Obviously, aggression has a lot of very negative consequences. It costs society a lot of money, time, and resources. So there are a lot of benefits to understanding from a psychology perspective what things contribute to aggression. Now, if I were to tell people in my research that I was directly studying aggression, I probably wouldn't get particularly truthful responses. So if I were to tell people, hey, the purpose of this research is to understand what makes people engage in aggressive behavior and what makes people do really bad things, chances are I'm probably going to get a very filtered down version of what people actually think, or I'm going to not attract the people that I probably want to hear a little bit more from. So whenever I did a study on aggression, particularly for my PhD on driving aggression, I actually never mentioned the word aggression. I would say things that were not untrue, things like this study is interested in understanding processes involved in conflict between drivers, just kind of to keep it a little bit more neutral. And that was always seen as okay by the ethics committee because, one, the benefits of getting that knowledge outweigh the risks, and two, I wasn't being fully deceptive. I never lied or deceived people about what they were being asked to do or why they were being studied. It was just simply being selective in my choice of words so as to not prime people to get the best information from them. So it's definitely, the beneficence principle isn't necessarily about getting rid of all risks and making it 100% risk-free. It's about being able to balance it so that what risks you do have are minimized, they're there for a reason, and that it's there to advance knowledge that will help us in some way, shape, or form. The final principle is respect, and this is very similar to the respect principle in the APS code, and that is making sure that we respect participants' welfare, we respect their privacy, we keep their information confidential, we respect their autonomy to choose to take part in a study and to choose to withdraw from it if they so wish to. Okay. So again, similar to how the APS code has those core principles and then standards that specify how those principles are enacted, the NH and MRC code presents its core principles and then a number of specific ethical consideration that researchers must make to adhere to these principles. So when researchers are designing their studies, these are the types of things that they need to keep in mind. So first and foremost, they need to keep harm in mind. So they need to make sure they are not causing participants harm, which obviously relates to the beneficence principle. Now, in psychological research, most of the time, the harm that we refer to or the harm that we experience is psychological harm or the discomfort rather than physical harm. And that can be discomfort from asking people about sensitive topics or things that they might not have really thought about all that much. Sometimes simply asking people to fill in pretty standard measures of personality traits can be a little uncomfortable because a lot of people have never really had to think about themselves before. So generally in psychology research, when we're talking about harm, most of the time, not all of the time, we're generally referring to psychological harm in the form of discomfort. But as I mentioned, we have to consider whatever study we're doing, whether the benefits of the harm outweigh the risks, and we further need to make sure that we can minimize those harms. So if there are ways that we can make the risk of harm even lower, then we need to make sure that we're doing that. Other consideration is informed consent, and that obviously relates to the respect principles. So we need to show respect to our research participants who are volunteering their time to help us so that they can make an informed decision about how comfortable or not so comfortable they might feel participating. So we do need to let them know to the best of our ability, without compromising the aims or the goals of our research, what risks might be attached to participating in the study. What tasks will they be asked to do? We need to let them know that they can withdraw from the study if they want. We certainly don't want people to feel pressured. So it's about giving participants the information that they need to make an informed decision about whether they will feel comfortable taking part in the study. Another consideration is deception, and this is kind of a balancing act between the respect principle and the research merit principle, and I kind of spoke about this earlier. We can't always let people know the true purpose of our study, because if they do, they can change their behaviour. So there might be some ways in which we deceive them. The issue is that deception can undermine informed consent, but by the same token, it can also be really beneficial in advancing knowledge. So yeah, it's about, if deception is involved in a study, it's about balancing the extent to which you deceive, if there's no suitable alternative, against how you're going to handle that deception and the potential impact that it might have on participants. Which brings me to my final point and the final consideration, which is debriefing. So if we've had to actively deceive, we have to tell participants what the true purpose of our research was and why we had to deceive them and apologize for it. So we have to give them the time to ask any questions that they have about the research, and offer them the opportunity to learn more about the research and the outcomes. So as I mentioned, all research that involves us going out and interacting with other human beings requires ethics approval from relevant ethics committees. Most often, this is university research or human ethics committees, but governments or certain government departments certainly have their own research ethics committees, and other research organisations, whether they're private ones or not-for-profit ones, they often have their own human research ethics committees as well. And if the project that someone is working on is a collaborative project between, say, a university, government, and not-for-profit research organisation, depending on how that project is set up, it's not uncommon for ethics approval to be needed from all of the relevant parties. Now, when it comes to putting together an ethics application, one of the keys to making a good one and making it a straightforward in terms of getting it approved is obviously being familiar with the NH and MRC code to begin with, knowing its principles, knowing the parameters that you have, but also knowing what you want to achieve. So what is the aim of your research? What is your research question? What is the thing that you're trying to answer? What's the thing that you're trying to better understand? Because if you know what information you want to gain from the research and the guidelines that you need to adhere to when trying to gain that knowledge, that can help inform how you design a study in such a way that it will both answer that question and adhere to ethical guidelines. Now, knowing that information as well, that also helps you to know which type of ethics application you need to put in for approval. Not all ethics applications are the same. Broadly speaking, they differentiate between a high-risk application and a low-risk application. Now, what you can see on the slide here, this is how ethics applications are categorized at JCU. While there might be small differences in how this works at other universities, the overall approach will broadly be similar in that the level of risk will be categorized, and the researcher needs to decide what level of risk they think their project is at, and then complete the relevant application. So at JCU, we have what we call no risk or negligible risk, which is where there is virtually no foreseeable or likely risks of harm or discomfort. Ones that fall into that category are pretty low. The next one, and this is where most psychology ones do fall into, that's what we call low risk. So that's studies where there is some likelihood of minor harm or minor discomfort occurring, or the harm that could result is really just minor discomfort. So if a study is either negligible risk or low risk, that is broadly what we also call a low risk application. And that means that it's just reviewed by one person, an appointed person that sits on the ethics committee, and they just review that in and of itself. Now, if it falls into category 3, and if it's what we call a high risk project, that might be situations where we're working with very vulnerable populations, or we are asking about quite sensitive materials or sensitive topics, any situation where we consider the risk or harm or distress to be slightly higher. In those situations, the application is reviewed by the full committee, meaning everyone that sits on it when they have their, however often they have them, when they have their meetings, the whole committee will review it. To give you an example, a study I once did looked at people's attitudes towards intimate partner violence. Obviously, this is quite a sensitive topic, so the application I needed to do was for a full committee review. It was approved. Any of this isn't to say that we can't ever research topics that are sensitive in nature, but it does mean that it certainly requires a higher level of scrutiny by the committee, because they need to be sure that if we're asking people about these sensitive topics, the benefits that we're going to get will outweigh the potential harm, and that we have managed the harm. So when committees are reviewing these high-risk applications, they need to see that the research team have put things in place to keep the risk as low as it can possibly be, and that they have put measures in place to manage the distress if it does occur. Okay, so that is it for this lecture bite. Thank you very much for listening along. That's, your introduction to research ethics in a nutshell. In seminars next week, you will explore research ethics a little bit further, and you'll get the opportunity to look at how you can design studies in a way that both advance knowledge but also adhere to ethical considerations. So thanks very much, everyone. Bye.